training. So we have now started the recording. So please be aware that any questions that you flag in the chat or Q&A are also part of that recording, and as well as information that we respond to or discuss in response to those questions. So as I mentioned, CCR has an open records project as well as a Southern office. So I wanted to give some background so folks know, who's in the room and additional initiatives of the Center for Constitutional Rights. So our Southern office, of which I'm a part and of which both Ian and Celine work in a virtual sense and a strategic sense. We partner with Southern grassroots movements, human rights defenders, and community organizations that are fighting to transform material conditions to dismantle systems of oppression and advance visions of collective liberation in the South. And while the Center for Constitutional Rights, it has certainly been around since 1966 and has done work all over the nation and also the globe, we also have done work in the South for decades, dating back to our founding in 1966. So this Southern office is not necessarily a new thing, it's a new reiteration, but it is our institutional recommitment of our resources, our presence, our people in the South. So we're really excited to be partnering on this training today with the Open Records Project. And now the Open Records Project is an initiative of Center for Constitutional Rights that uses public records requests as important tools in our social justice work, along with partners and communities and movements. Our unique approach really intends to center our allies' vision for accountability and social change in our legal and advocacy work. So before we get to the substance of the training, I do want to point out a few additional housekeeping items on top of the fact that we are recording this webinar. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat feature. We will be monitoring both places for questions, but we're going to try to answer the majority of questions at the end of the webinar for purposes of efficiency and timing. So with that, I will turn it over to my amazing colleague, Ian.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here with you all for this webinar and my amazing co-hosts. I'm Ian, he, him pronouns, running the Open Records Project at CCR officially since 2019. And we will be talking about some great resources. Again, we really see at CCR the Open Records Project and using FOIA and state open records requests as a way to kind of advance movement campaigns or a tool to potentially advance or use in your movement campaigns and organizing strategies. Maybe not always the most or the best tool at the moment, but often a very useful tool. And we'll get into that in a second. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Celine.
Hi, my name is Celine. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a Justice Fellow here at the Center for Constitutional Rights, which also means I'm a staff attorney. I work with Ian a lot on FOIA things, the Open Records Project. I am also housed on our gender justice team, which does LGBTQ plus litigation and coalition work as well. And I also get to work with Emily on some Southern cases there. I largely help out with environmental justice and racism cases. And I'm also on our habeas team that's challenging everything that the Trump administration is trying to do to deport people unlawfully right now. So that's a little bit of me. Today's agenda, as on the slide. So those were introductions, check. Next, we're just going to talk about really briefly the pros and cons of using federal FOIA. Then we're going to talk about a case example and sort of look at the different parts of a FOIA request on a case that Ian and I are working on together. And then afterwards, we will hopefully answer all of your questions, time permitting.
Okay, so let's get into it. I know we just said pros and cons, but I'm going to start with the cons first, so we can keep things moving forward in a positive direction. I, I- I've done a lot of FOIAs. I've done a lot of FOIA litigation. I want to be really transparent about kind of uh, what I would say are kind of some of the weaknesses of FOIA at this point in time. I think maybe FOIA was more useful in certain ways back decades ago, and the kind of government bureaucracy and powers that be have kind of made certain aspects of the Freedom of Information Act more difficult to use, and that's really unfortunate. So just wanted to kind of be honest about some of the issues with FOIA right now, that it might not be the tool you need immediately, and things to think about when using it. So FOIA requests can do take a long time. We are talking a long, long time if you don't litigate them, especially when it comes to law enforcement agencies. It's not always going to be like that, but unfortunately, a lot of the time these days it is when we're talking about ICE, FBI, and other agencies. Um, and so I think you want to keep that in mind, because I know organizing campaigns will often be running much faster than the months, if not year or more, it takes to get records back on a FOIA request. So keep that in mind. We're going to be talking about strategies to use the FOIA process for advocacy in a second, but starting kind of just if you're expecting the records to come next week, unfortunately, that doesn't happen very much these days. In order to get documents, like I said, that means it might mean litigating. And I know a lot of people, I know there's lawyers in the audience right now, but a lot of us don't have access necessarily to legal counsel, especially legal counsel that has time to work, at least initially pro bono, to litigate a FOIA request. And so it's good to keep that in mind. And if you do think you really need these documents, you want to find a lawyer, then we can talk about that, and you can reach out to me later. But it's something to keep in mind in order to kind of get substantive documents from these, especially these big law enforcement agencies. If you get documents, I know people have said this, submitted some information when they registered about redacted documents and the frustrations with that. I think there is a level of, even when, say, we go to court and we're getting documents and, we're fighting the government to get hundreds of pages a month, whatever it might be, a lot of those documents still, you don't have a total sense of what that's going to be. And so you want to be prepared that there might be a lot of redactions that might take additional time to fight. There might be documents you get that are out of date and no longer relevant to your campaign, or just other documents that are kind of junk. So, and in between those, hopefully there's some really amazing documents, but it's something to just keep in mind that it's hard to predict what might happen. And then just in general, the process of back and forth with the agencies can be frustrating. I know folks who are in attendance who have done FOIAs know all about that. They can kind of go in a million different directions. And so that is a real thing to take into account. And now Celine is going to give an overview of the wonderful ways that we can use FOIA.
Yeah, so even if it takes a long time, even if you're really pulling teeth, there's still good that can come out of filing a FOIA. So one part of it is that you can do advocacy and media around your record request, regardless of how long it takes. So doing things like a press release or social media is often a great thing to do. Because oftentimes, when you're requesting records, it's because you have an idea of what they might say or what you might hope they say. And filing a records request is a great just point or moment to kind of be like, hey, we think these records exist. We think this is wrong, or sort of whatever your campaign is. So regardless, you can always do media around your actual filing. Relatedly, connecting with journalists or legislators about your requests is also a really great idea because sometimes journalists, you don't know how, but they have access to things that you don't have. So sometimes like journalists have actually come to us and been like, we've seen this memo, and then we can then take that memo and then like put it as a part of our request and be like, we're looking for more stuff like this. So it's good to have connections with whoever your local movers and shakers are, be they journalists or legislators, because they might hold information that can help make your record request more precise. And the more precise and specific it is, like showing examples or basically being like, we know this exists in this form because this other thing exists, is one of the easiest ways to get a FOIA, actually get requests from a FOIA. So publishing key documents you might get back in briefing guides. So sometimes if you get a ton of documents and they don't necessarily make a lot of sense to a person whose head isn't in it, making a briefing guide is a really good idea to lay out to both, a general audience and also journalists or whoever you're trying to advocate to break down what the issues are in a way that's really digestible. I kind of touched on it before, using documents you get back for future or additional requests. Having something in hand to say, we know this exists, we know something like this exists, is a really great way to sort of force the FOIA officer that you're working with to acknowledge that what you're asking for actually exists. Because sometimes they'll tell you that it doesn't, but you know it does. And then think through each moment of the request or litigation process for potential advocacy. So not only when you file your initial FOIA can you do present advocacy. If you so choose to litigate, you can also do advocacy the moment that you file a complaint. So any moment in there when you receive files, too, that can be a really great point for you to be like, here are the files that we received. This is what they say. But yeah, like litigating FOIA or like actually getting documents can be a really frustrating process. And something hopefully that makes it a little bit better is knowing that each step of the way you can make noise about whatever is happening, even if what is happening is inaction.
And I also would add an additional advocacy possibility, though this may be somewhat behind the scenes, is using FOIA and in turn state open records acts to discover information that may be relevant to a legal challenge that you or partners are developing. Of course, before a lawsuit is filed, there isn't access to discovery. I mean, in most instances, sometimes there is pre-filing discovery, but right, you haven't initiated the discovery process yet. And so, but you want to get access to documents that are relevant to your claims, that would inform your claims and relief that your future clients or present clients are going to seek or want to seek. So, FOIA can also be helpful in direct connection to building a legal case, and we definitely have done that. But of course, don't want to share the ins and outs of some of the developing litigation. But yeah, don't. It's never really too early, basically, to use FOIA before litigation.
Yeah, and I think this really is the way that we've gotten ahead of the fact that it's really hard to get records fast these days without litigation. And so we we've had some amazing success. I can go into some examples later, but we've filed FOIAs, gotten a press release, and never really followed up farther than that initial filing of the FOIA. But because we made that public demand, we accomplished the goal of our movement partners in that moment. And so I think it's just always good to be creative. And I urge people to be creative with ways to use the process. I'm sure there's a lot of ways that we haven't even done yet that you all could think of using different points in the FOIA process as potentially kind of moments of advocacy. All right. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is great because I want to make sure there's lots of time for questions at the end so that we're not just talking at you over and over again. We are going to talk about this case that we are currently litigating with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. I can't tell because I can't see the list, but if anyone from Florence is in the audience, but they are amazing, based out in Arizona. And I'm just going to kind of talk through a brief summary of how we came to litigate this FOIA and then how we put the request together, and then pass it over to Celine to kind of talk through how we've been litigating it up through recently. I think CCR, over the course of at least my time at CCR, I started there here in 2009. We have done a number of FOIAs and litigated a number of FOIAs in support of immigrant rights, and we've connected with just amazing organizers. I'm sure some of you are on this webinar right now at Detention Watch Network, National Day Labor Organizing Network, Immigrant Defense Project, just so many amazing people out there. And so as we have kind of connected, people have come to us asking, can we, can we partner with CCR to do this FOIA as part of our movement campaign? Can we partner with you to litigate? And so that's how we connected with folks in Florence. They were seeing some really problematic things, to say the least, happening with their clients. And they reached out to us. And so you can see in the bullet points that basically what the FOIA focuses on is what would basically, in general be termed, race science, right? Like racist use of supposed but completely BS so-called science to enact certain policies that directly affect people. And here, basically, ICE and HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement within HHS, which handles most of the work with immigrant children, are looking at dental x-rays of kids and deciding simply from a dental x-ray that they are now an adult and should be put in an ICE detention center in a more brutal environment in prison rather than where they are uh, uh, held here, which I'm not saying is a wonderful place, but is definitely not an ICE detention center. And so Florence was seeing a lot of this, and they were especially seeing a lot of it in regards to Black and South Asian immigrants. And so they wanted to work with us to file a FOIA and get more information and data and statistics about this issue. And so we work with them to put together a FOIA request, obviously. And this is kind of the key parts of the FOIA requests that we how we assemble them at CCR. And we kind of talk through how to highlight certain things in the request. And I'm going to kind of break down and use this request as an example of how we put together our FOIAs. So I'm going to go through each of these pieces. One thing I do want to say as I get into this and this process is that I wish I had time to kind of expound on all the different parts of what you can put into a FOIA and the kind of back and forth after the FOIA and everything. And unfortunately, we want to keep this efficient. We want to answer your questions. And so I'm not going to be able to go into detail on all parts of kind of the FOIA process for folks who haven't done FOIA requests before, but as you'll see at the end, I'm happy to answer questions after, both during the webinar and afterwards too. So the first thing we do, and some of this might seem very basic, but it is really important to your FOIA request, and again, also important if you end up litigating that request at the federal level, is you identify who you're making the request to. There is a large federal bureaucracy out there. Apologies, can't say that word today. And I think a lot of us know that kind of the big agencies like ICE, CBP, DHS, we know about them. And you don't necessarily need to know more than that. That's where you're going to send your request to. But it can be really helpful and important to identify the smaller offices and components and maybe even individuals within those agencies and kind of highlight those at the start of your request. So when we make our request here, we made it to Department of Health and Human Services, and then we specified Office of Refugee Resettlement. And again, if you're not sure how all this works, because I don't know this stuff off the top of my head, just go on their website. Even now with Trump kind of demolishing a lot of the federal websites, there's still usually you're able to find kind of an organizational chart that shows you what the different components are or what the basic components of these places are. And so we kind of identified that they should search all the appropriate offices. Depending if we were kind of here we're looking nationally, but if we were looking, say, just at Arizona, we want to make sure we identified kind of the Arizona field office maybe, or the appropriate field office in the area as well, stuff like that. So it's good to kind of especially mark up priority places that you want them to search, because this is where they're supposed to really be doing their searches for records in response to your request. The next thing we do is, and this goes to the advocacy thing that me and Celine were talking about earlier, is we will often, and I said most of our FOIA requests, include kind of maybe 1 to 3 pages laying out why we're filing this request. This is not necessary to file a FOIA request. You can file a FOIA request and you do not have to give a reason why you're filing the FOIA request. But if you're using the FOIA request and the process of the FOIA request as kind of an advocacy tool, then we find it really useful to kind of tell a story at the beginning of the FOIA request, give a background, because you should think of this FOIA request not only as something that's going to go to a FOIA officer sitting at the agency, but something that organizers can read, your fellow lawyers or journalists or other people can read. Definitely journalists can read. That's going to be out there in the public. And so this is kind of a public demand that legislators can check out, and they're going to understand it's not just a dry request for records, but it has a context. It tells a story of why we're doing this, why we're making this demand, why it's so urgent, and why it's so important right now for the people impacted by these policies. So you can see here we've included this is just examples. Again, you can look at that. You can go to that link and look at the full request on our website. I know some of the sites I included on the slide are very legalistic. You don't need to be super legalistic with the kind of citations, but it is useful to include kind of recent citations. Hey, last week, the head of HHS was talking about this program and how they're going to expand it. Those kinds of examples are really useful to include in your story, or even testimony from organizers, maybe public tweets that are out there about the work that's been done. All this kind of stuff is potentially stuff you can include in this section. The next section is defining the terms. This is kind of legalistic, but it can be really useful. You don't have to include a bunch of terms. It's really up to you. The most important thing, I think, to define, and we have a lot of this boilerplate language you can cut and paste from our website, no problem at all, is what is a record? Records, right? It's basically just a check on the agencies so they can come back and say, well, you said communications, but we just thought communications meant handwritten letters through the U.S. Postal Service, right? And it usually won't be that ridiculous, but it is important that, say, and it's not in this records list here, but let's say you want to add signal messages, Facebook direct messages, other kinds of texts, right? Capture as much as you can. That's what a record is. That's what you should be searching for, all those different types of records. And if you have to argue about it later, you can always come back to the request and say, hey, I told you I wanted those signal messages too. It's in my request. You should have searched for that. So that's why it can be useful to kind of define groups of things. And especially here, you'll see that we define something called an age determination memo and a medical age assessment report. These are important to the kind of records that we were looking for in this specific request in regards to how these agencies assign age and use this race science in their processing of people. Let's go to the next slide. The next section of our FOIA requests that we do is the most important section. This is the actual request itself. And this is just part, again, of the broader requests that you can look at on our website, and you can kind of see how we laid out the different types of requests for records, and the kind of both specificity, but also not too specific kind of parts of each of these requests. You can see that we gave kind of a time frame for the different requests. You can see on the number 4 how we started kind of giving a breakdown of the different ways we wanted this type of data broken down. And again, there's different ways you can do this. Happy to talk through that as a strategy. One very basic thing on this part of the FOIA request is it's really good to number it so that you can, when you end up going back and forth with the agency, whether you're in litigation or not, you can say, look, you responded to number 1 and 2 of my request, but you never responded to number 3. Can you go back and search for records responsive to number 3? So this is obviously the most important part because it's the actual request for documents, and it's good to spend some time kind of crafting this as best as possible. The next part of the request that we have in most of our FOIA requests is something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today, but in federal FOIA, you can ask for what's called a fee waiver, so a waiver of all the processing fees. Agencies have the ability to charge you money for the kind of copying. It used to be copying, now it's just kind of the production and processing of and searching of documents. But I would assume everyone here at this webinar are doing these requests in the public interest. And if you're doing them in the public interest, there is a way to request a full waiver of all those fees at the federal level. States is a totally different conversation, but we always include a federal fee waiver. I have boilerplate language that I'm always happy to share with folks, so you can copy off of the requests on our website with some good sites. And I think a couple sites to case law in there as well. And just make that argument. You have no commercial interest in the fees, and it should be the corporations and the creepy big commercial interests that are charged fees and not the rest of us. So we always include a request for a fee waiver. The other thing that you won't see on the screen here, but is mentioned, the expedited processing. That's another thing that you can ask for at the federal level. It basically is what the records I'm asking for are really important. I need to jump the line in the processing because what I'm asking for is going to have an immediate impact on my partners, on my community, on, like on actual people right now. And so we need these records urgently. This is something that unfortunately seems to be really hard to get these days, but why I always include and ask for expedited processing in FOIAs is because it creates a record of urgency. It creates a written record that you can come back to potentially later down the road saying, look, judge, or look, agency person, whatever it might be, or look, public, look, organizers. We've been saying from the start, this is a really urgent public demand for records. These records are really important. So that's kind of why I always keep that in there. And then the next part is just a couple additional pointers. Again, I wish I had time to kind of talk more about all of this, but I want to cede the mic to Celine in a second because I've been rambling at you for a long time. But what I'll say is that it's important to put a kind of very specific information, contact information in your request. That might seem kind of like, of course, why wouldn't I do that? But sometimes I think, especially because, a lot of us are doing community organizing, we're doing this with different partner organizations. We might have come up with this request with 10 different people, put this together. We want to give everyone credit. That's great. But on a FOIA request, I think it's really important to let the agency know that you have one specific person or contact, whether it's an email, mailing address, whatever, that is going to be a place that they can send all that correspondence back and forth to. So because otherwise it can get lost, it can get confused. There's going to be back and forth. And so you want to make that really, really clear. I'm just going to run through these next two bullet points really fast, but make sure you have some kind of written proof that they got the FOIA request. Like I said, unfortunately, these agencies love to delay, use excuses for why they aren't responding. And one of those excuses is going to be, hey, we just never got your FOIA request, even though you know that they probably did. So if there's a way, whether it's using some kind of certified mail situation, or if you send it via email or on a web platform and you haven't gotten some kind of notification back or acknowledgement back, I would just call their office, that all these FOIA offices usually have numbers, and kind of just push them again and again. Hey, I want to make sure you got my request. I want to make sure it's processed. And if you don't hear back or you don't get that back in a few days, file it again. Just keep doing it until you have proof that they actually got the request. And then finally, and I know this is a kind of a bigger thing, what do you do when agencies delay, deny, redact? I think if agencies delay, like we've said, find ways to use the process for advocacy. If you can, journalists, legislators, everything Celine talked about. If they redact, I think I can go into that a little later, and there's a lot more information on our website, FOIA Basics Guide for Activists, that goes into that and has some examples. You can appeal denials of kind of any adverse determination on your request, and we have a lot of examples on that website. And I do feel like the best way to explain how to write those appeals and put them together is by using those examples. So again, this is my job. I'm happy to kind of talk through that separately and answer some questions about that later. But that website is the best place for all of that. And I will say on the Florence FOIA, that coming back to the specific case example here, we sent these FOIA requests out and we never got any responses within the time frame that they are supposed to answer us. They're supposed to get back to you within 20 working days at the federal level. They can take an extra 10 working days if they want to. We never heard back from them at all. And so once they kind of get past that point, then if they haven't gotten back and what's called made a determination on your request, then you can go to court. And so we kind of assumed, having done these FOIAs, that this likely would be the scenario. And so we went into court. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Celine to talk about kind of what's been happening at that point in that stage.
Great, thank you, Ian. So a bit of timeline. The FOIA requests were first filed in this case back in June. Like Ian said, they blew past all their deadlines, so folks filed the complaint in September, and it wasn't until November that we saw any documents. So that's just like giving you a timeline. Like even if you have a legal team behind you, it's still going to take a minute to get these files in your hands. But we're sort of in the thick of it. So documents have been coming in from different agencies and our team has been reviewing it. I think this is also a really good point to sort of emphasize how important it is to have partners or like be in partnership or be working with folks that know how to read the documents, right? Like I am not an immigration lawyer, so when I look at the documents, I can glean patterns. I can be like, this seems strange, and I have questions. But it's so important for us that our co-counsel is the Florence Project because they see these documents day in and day out, and they have a far better idea of how the system works, the players in it. And so, having the record is one half of the battle, and the other half of the battle is having folks that can translate it for you, not only, to fellow lawyers, but also to journalists, to legislators, to the community that you are trying to advocate for. So yeah, that's just a plug for being connected. And also a plug for being in touch with journalists and researchers. It's really great to have these connections earlier on. So say, for example, when you file your FOIA request, if you make these connections, then when you get the actual records and you interpret them, you already have like a good connect for who you're going to talk to about this, to get it out into the news, to get it out into the media. And also another big part of this is when you're in the litigation part is negotiating with the AUSAs, which are Assistant United States Attorneys. It's a real luck of the draw. Like typically AUSAs like aren't thrilled to be doing FOIA work, so usually they're just sort of annoyed. But luckily for this one, we have like pretty reasonable AUSAs that respond to our emails and communicate like people. So that's helped roll the ball along, but we've still bumped into issues where they say they're going to produce something and then the agency doesn't, or there's sort of representatives of the agency. So oftentimes they come and they say like, I said this, and we have to be like, no, thank you. Like, please go back to ICE and, here's our counter proposal. So that brings me to the next point, which is that there have been changes with the new administration. Fun little agency called DOJ has been cutting a lot of staff, and that also means FOIA staff. So in this case, our AUSAs back in April let us know, like, hey, the Department of Health and Human Services can't like produce records this month because the entire FOIA office in this component has been put on administrative leave. And when we put that in our joint status report, which is basically the document, when you're in these negotiations, you submit a document to the court to essentially say, we're keeping the ball moving, we're negotiating, we're getting there. That the court called a conference to discuss. At the conference, the judge very plainly pointed out that you can't avoid your obligations under FOIA law by just firing all the staff. So he essentially ordered the AUSAs to go back to their client, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, and say, you need to give an answer that's not, I don't know. So now we're in the midst of, figuring out those negotiations, but that's just sort of an example of the back and forth that you have to do. And it's also, frankly, logistically challenging, especially when you have several different agencies that you're requesting documents from. So like ICE versus Custom and Border Patrol versus USCIS, or like all these different agencies, you have to keep track of like what you said to them and what they said to you and the status of each negotiation and each email and each communication, so that when you talk about it, you sort of know exactly what you're talking about. This case is actually, only a handful, but I'm on another one where we recently filed 17 FOIAs to 17 different agencies. And for that, we need an Excel spreadsheet, because otherwise there's just no way to keep track of everything that you're hearing back and forth from each individual agency, because each individual agency is going to respond to you. They're not going to respond to you all at once, even if you litigate them all together, which you often do in a request like this. If the requests are related or about the same thing, even if you're litigating them together, you still have to negotiate and communicate with each individual agency, which frankly just takes a lot of time. Ian, anything else you'd like to add?
I'll just say real quick, that's yeah, all totally on point. I think before we get into the Q&As, I just have one more, and I just like one more slide, just always harping on this. That's why, because of how kind of random this can be, because of how sometimes frustrating it can be, think of the advocacy moments as you move forward. So kind of coming back to that, doing press releases with the filing of the FOIA, or doing press releases with the filing of the complaint in the case when we still haven't gotten any records and we're going into court. Um, uh, these aren't press releases, or these aren't kind of announcements necessarily that are, hey, we're filing a FOIA request for some documents, right? What they really are using the FOIA request as a springboard to talk about the issue. And so this is an example of a FOIA litigation that we're winding down now, but might wind up again, which is a Trump program from the first administration to enact giant fines on several women taking sanctuary around the country who are speaking out. And so it was a way to silence and intimidate whole, obviously, immigrant communities, but especially these women, and target them. And that FOIA developed, and this goes back to Emily's point earlier, that FOIA, we got documents, but we used all the moments in that FOIA, including the filing, to not just do press releases, but I believe we did 2 different press conferences with different filings in those moments when we still hadn't gotten that many records, where we invited reporters to come and hear directly from some of the women who were currently at that point still in sanctuary. And so really we were using that FOIA as a springboard for more. And we actually did a separate non-FOIA litigation coming out of the records that we got, which ultimately forced Biden to drop the fines program when he came into office, and all the women were able to leave sanctuary safely. So I think this is just kind of ideas of how to kind of keep thinking of those advocacy moments in the process, and not think of FOIA just as a thing where, oh my God, it's not working because I haven't gotten any documents yet. I mean, sometimes that's the case, but yeah, advocacy is just really important. And now time for questions. I know there's a couple that have already come in through the Q&A part of the webinar, which is great. And there's a number of questions that people submitted when they registered as well. I see 2 from Evan Lyons here. The first one, I'm just going to answer these. The first one, and others please chime in. When requesting correspondence between agencies, which agency should you send your request to? Both of them, or the smaller one? So this is a good question in a certain sense. I think send them to both. No problem sending to both of them. But at the federal level, I didn't go into this, but there are certain parts of the federal government that you cannot, unfortunately, send FOIA requests to. You can't send it to the president, can't send them to Congress, you can't send them to most of the federal courts. How do you get at those places when you can't send FOIA requests directly to them? You can send FOIA requests to agencies like ICE, FBI, etc., who are in communication, say, with congressional staffers or with people in the president's office. And once those other places that you can't directly hit up are in communication with agencies that you can, those are potentially up for grabs, those communications. And I'm going to pass this next one to Emily.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Evan, for your question, which I'll read so everyone can hear it. Local state agencies may not be covered under FOIA, but under state right to know laws. In Philadelphia, one must use a standardized form for requesting records, which may require abbreviated language. Is it worth it to send a longer letter detailing the request? And would this request outside the standardized form have any standing in court? Really great question. So I assume by right to know laws, you mean state open records laws, or even there are sometimes cities or counties will have their own local laws around public records as well. So I assume that's what you mean by right to know. And what we've done before is where an agency may have a specific process for submitting open records requests, we will follow that process, but sometimes attach the longer request, as you suggest in your question, for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think the longer request could be instructive to the agency that is searching for a response to your open records request, but also for all the advocacy reasons that both Celine and Ian have mentioned. So you still have record of, what this request is and how it may relate to a broader advocacy campaign. So yes, to your question, there is a way to do both by just attaching the longer request to the form that an agency may require.
Sorry, I was muted. Didn't realize. Two other questions. Or one is just a point of an important point to make. Michael Binder says that you should indicate what form you want to receive the desired records. Definitely a really good point. Electronic records can often be faster than getting them on a CD. At the same time, you want to remember that some of these agencies have not digitized all of their records. So if you're requesting records from long ago, potentially, those records may still be sitting in boxes, unfortunately. And so if you think that there might be non-electronic records, it's good to specify that too. And then Kamala has asked if we provide pro bono service towards FOIA litigation. What I would say we provide, and this mostly runs through me, but I will often loop in folks like Celine and Emily, is strategic advice and strategic like reviewing, helping draft, giving templates, that kind of thing. I think we're all operating, and I assume a lot of people on this webinar are operating at pretty maximum capacity. It doesn't mean we won't take pro bono cases, but I would say for the most part, we prioritize cases coming from our grassroots partners, and kind of going through our own internal process is how we put together our litigation. But I am always open, and maybe we'll throw up a slide in a couple minutes, giving my contact information, all of our contact information, and you are always welcome to reach out to me with any FOIA type questions. I don't see any other questions coming through in the chat, but there are a number of questions that people posed when they registered. So I don't know, I can start answering a couple of these, and Emily and Celine, please chime in if you want to add to anything here. I think some of them we've answered. One person asked about kind of a redaction question, how to counter argue to law enforcement's cursory claim that the disclosure of requested information harms the national security, public order, crime prevention, etc. And I think that's a good question because a lot of our FOIA requests to these law enforcement agencies are dealing with information that some of them would rather not share and they want to redact, right? And so I think that while it's going to be hard to unredact everything at the federal level, especially, you might have more luck with some of the state requests. Um, uh, what you can kind of argue are a couple of things. One thing is that these places are supposed to what's called segregate off information that is not kind of exempt or privileged. And so, uh, for instance, it's one thing if they're kind of talking about their nefarious law enforcement program and what secret database, or I don't even want to say that, but like how people might be assigned within that. But it's another thing if there are factual parts that should be segregated out that are not kind of their own thoughts about how to conduct those investigations. So if like the factual names of a database, like I don't see why necessarily that couldn't be revealed, or uh this if they're conducting surveillance um on public social media, well, show me which social media pages that you're surveilling. These are factual things, they're already public, they shouldn't be redacted. I think there's kind of think through what parts and press people for uh disclosing um at least the kind of factual non-exempt parts of when it comes to law enforcement related requests. Um, we talked about the impacts of Trump, as you heard from Celine, on FOIA offices right now. Um, but don't let that dissuade you from filing FOIA requests. That's their responsibility. It's not our responsibility. They need to respond to these FOIA requests. I think there's a lot of the time, um, government FOIA officers will kind of try to intimidate you um, uh, to to kind of stop filing, and don't let them intimidate you when it comes to filing your FOIA request or pressing forward on your FOIA request. I'm going to pass it over to Emily.
Thanks, Ian. I think you may have answered this other question that was sent by an attendee before the webinar, but this question is about determining when to give up because preparing and appealing and going back and forth with a FOIA officer and the respective agency can be very time consuming and potentially even I don't, maybe demoralizing is too strong of a word, right? But frustrating at minimum. And so I think, when to quote unquote give up per this person's question is going to be very, individualized up to the person. But I think because of how time consuming a FOIA strategy can become, much like other strategies in pursuit of a campaign, to the extent there are resources for this, having, one or two people who can be dedicated to pursuing the drafting, the submitting, the following up with the agency, the correspondence with the agency, then that would be great. Again, I recognize that everybody is stretched super thin, but I think just like with other tools, right, in support of a campaign, it's great to try to, have someone who's dedicated to that stream of work. But in terms of when to further pursue, yeah, very individualized. And I wouldn't even look at it necessarily as giving up, because even along the way, if you're not successful with the appeal or you decide not to further to complete the appeal process or exhaust, right, that route, then you still may have obtained what you need to, and maybe don't always realize it initially, but there could be helpful data points, helpful data, helpful background that you're pulling along the way, even in terms of, right, best practices, next steps, when you're pursuing FOIA requests in the future. So if anything, it's not, I don't want folks to look at it as giving up necessarily, in full recognition that yes, it can be a lot of work and we're all pretty stretched.
Yeah, just to that point, one more thing is uh, I think that's because of that frustration and because it's a lot of work. Sometimes a FOIA request can just be the request, and that's it. and you go in knowing, you know what, we're not going to pursue this because it's going to take a lot of extra work and a lot of time and a lot of back and forth, and we don't have capacity for that in our organizing, but we do have capacity to kind of write up this public demand and do some advocacy around that. We did a FOIA request for a group out in Kenya, who were organizing against CIA and Department of Defense involvement in basically killings and kidnappings of Muslim people in this certain part of Kenya. It was supported by the CIA. We knew we wouldn't get any documents from that FOIA request, and they knew as well when we went into it, it would be a huge battle. But they told us, look, if you put this FOIA request together and you do a press release on this topic, this is going to generate big media in Kenya when you file it. Having a US organization publicly say, we want this information about these horrible things happening in Kenya. And when we did it, it made the front page of two newspapers out in Kenya. So, and that was all they want. That organization, it's an amazing organization, Mahuri, and this FOIA request is on our website. That was the goal. That was it. And so we let the rest of that go. So I think that there's a lot of different creative ways that you can use this kind of official kind of government mechanism for advocacy without going the entire kind of route. And I'm going to pass it back to Emily.
Thanks, Ian. And I realize that we are at time. There are a couple of more questions. So we're going to share our contact information. Oh, it's already up here. Big thanks to Alice Wang, who is running this show in the background. You may not be able to see her, but please do reach out to us so we can address these additional questions, because we do want to be, a partner and to support any open records requests that you all are seeking to submit now or in the future. So thank you again for attending our opening series of FOIA basics FOIA and Fight Back. I'm reading the screen instead of going off of my brain. FOIA and Fight Back. Please look out for future webinar sessions on Open Records Act strategies under Southern state laws. We have 4 tentatively planned now for Open Records Acts in Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, and Alabama. Again, those will be the second Tuesday of every month at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And we do plan as a concluding session as part of the series to do another webinar on FOIA again, so open records at the federal level. Once again, we all want to encourage you to please reach out. We're happy, as Ian offered, to put our eyes on any requests you all are drafting and to find other ways that we can support, which can include just forming new relationships with all of you all in the communities and organizations you work with. So thank you again for joining, and I do hope everyone takes good care of themselves. Oh, and lastly, I'm going to add the website for our Sweet Tea with Transparency, which is our open records resource for movements in the South. And this will be a primary focus of the upcoming state-based Open Records Act trainings. Thank you again. Take care.